All right, Erev Tov, everybody, for our last week together, before our Devarim hiatus. And as always, an invitation to let me know if there are commentaries we have already learned from, or those we haven't learned from that you'd be interested in including in our four books next year, like this fall, I should say. Um, we have a double Parsha, Matot-Masei, and one of the central narratives is the story of Moshe's communication with representatives of Reuven and Gad about their desire to settle on the east side of the Jordan, and Moshe's response. That's what Rav Samet focuses in on. Let me share my screen. Okay, Moshe's speech to God and Reuven. As always, there's a more expanded version in Hebrew, but we get all the central ideas a little more digestible form here in this English translation and abridgment. Okay, Moshe's speech to God and Reuven. Starting off with the question, was Moshe's reaction justified? In chapter 32 of Parashat Matot, the tribes of Gad and Reuven present their request to Moshe. If we have found favor in your eyes, let this land on the east bank of the Jordan be given to your servants as a possession. Do not bring us over the Jordan, al ta'avirenu et ha'Yarden, meaning to cross into the land of Israel. Moshe responds with a lengthy and harsh monologue, verses 6 to 15, accusing them of trying to evade the responsibility of participating in the war of conquest with their brethren. He compares them to the spies who had turned the hearts of the nation from the mission of reaching the land. And behold, you have risen up in place of your fathers, a tradition of sinful men, to stoke again God's anger against Israel. From Moshe's perspective, their request is likely to lead to results similar to those of the sin of the spies, or even worse. You will destroy all of this nation. The two tribes respond to this rebuke by offering to leave their wives and children to settle the east bank, while the men lead the Israelite forces in their war of conquest to Eretz Yisrael. Moshe's anger is assuaged, and he accepts their proposal. Just to see briefly this story. Hopefully we can see it. There we go. Reuben and Gad own cattle in great numbers, and they come to Moshe, Elazar, and the chieftains. They name these cities that God has conquered. It's cattle country, and your servants have cattle. We get their request to let us stay here. Al ta'avirenu et ha'Yarden, don't move us across the Jordan. Moshe begins his long challenge, retelling the story of the scouts and how terrible that was. And now you're stepping into the same role, and you will bring destruction upon this people. Then they come near and say, okay, we're going to build these sheepfolds here. We will go ahead until the war is completed, while our children stay back. We won't return home till every Israelite is in possession of their portion, but then we're going to stay, come back and remain on the east side of the Jordan. How are we to understand Moshe's harsh monologue? Does his accusation of the tribes of Gad and Reuven arise from a misunderstanding of their intentions, such that following their clarification, Moshe realizes his mistake? Or does Moshe, in fact, understand their intention all too well, such that only his accusatory attack changes their original intention and leads them to their subsequent proposal? In other words, were they planning all along to do this? Like they were just saying, don't make us settle there. But of course, they always intended to go across, conquer, and then come back. And Moshe got all bent out of shape for nothing. And then they were just coming back and saying, no, you misunderstood us. Well, of course, we're going to go over and conquer and then come back and settle. Or were they planning to just stay put and never cross over? And when Moshe got so angry, they said, oh, gosh, you're right. Or at least we better come up with a counter offer. And they do. That's the question. The answer to this question depends on our interpretation of the words of the two tribes in verse 5. Al ta'virenu et hayarden, don't bring us over the Jordan. Do they mean that they should not be brought over at all? That they should be left in the conquered territories, right? To stay there for good and not participate in the war, in the conquest? Or is their request that they not be brought over tantamount to saying merely that they do not wish to inherit land on the other side of the Jordan, right? Don't force us to cross over and settle there, but of course we're going to participate in the conquest. The commentators were divided on this question. The Ramban appears to believe that the situation involved a misunderstanding on Moshe's part, and the Abarbanel says this explicitly. The children of Gad and Ruvain wish to tell Moshe when they circle back and say we're going to, go over and fight. Wish to tell Moshe that despite his great wisdom, he had misunderstood their intention. Out of respect for him, they approached him to tell him quietly, "Our master, you have not understood our words and our intention. We do not wish to settle here immediately. Rather, we shall pass over armed and go to war with our brethren." Maybe that's, and we'll see Rav Samet circle back to this. Maybe that's what's behind this Vayigashu Elav. They came up, close, intimately, to kind of just quietly clarify, Moshe, you misunderstood. Of course, we're in for the conquest. However, Rav Yitzchak Arama, the Akedat Yitzchak, believes otherwise and writes, "Indeed, it appears that Moshe, our master of blessed memory, with his wealth of wisdom, understood their true intention, for their original intention was not to pass over with them to war. And this is what they meant when they said, 'Do not bring us over the Jordan,' meaning at all. Let us just leave us here. Moreover, it is not written in verse 16, and the children of Gad and the children of Reuben said to him, but rather, and they approached him and said, meaning that they had heard what he said and had reconsidered, and thereafter they came back to him with their answer. So now, Vayigshu Elav, they drew near, doesn't mean, they came up to just gently clarify what they meant all along, and they were trying to kind of prevent Moshe from embarrassment at his misunderstanding. It means, whoa, they were kind of blown back by his critique, took some time to, collect their thoughts, conference, and then they came back again with a counter offer in response to Moshe's critique, which forced them to reconsider their original plan. It's a good question, and it's not obvious. And as Rosam is going to flesh out for us, there are implications, to these different possibilities. This is not simply a local exegetical debate on the interpretation of one particular verse, i.e., the "don't make us cross over the Jordan." Is it at all, or just to settle there? Rather, the question concerns our perception of the entire point of the story. According to the Baal HaKedah, the point is clear. Moshe Rabbeinu, the loyal shepherd of the nation, took up the challenge of this renewed danger of national disintegration, a danger which again threatened the imminent inheritance of the land. Through his harsh words, he treats the threat before it develops, straightening out the problem with the two tribes who are causing the danger. But what is the point of the story if we follow the interpretation of Ramban and Abarbanel? If there was a misunderstanding between Moshe and the tribes of Gad and Ruvain, why does the Torah recount it, and at such length? It would seem that according to these commentators, the following conclusion is unavoidable. This story, like the incident of Mei Meribah, which precedes it, comes to illustrate the lack of understanding between Moshe, leader of the generation that had left Egypt and had died in the desert, and the generation that was about to enter the land. Moshe is haunted by the memory of the sin of the spies, and he sees its shadow in the actions of the new generation. But this generation is unlike the preceding one. On the contrary, they are eager for battle and are wholeheartedly prepared to fight and conquer the land. This, by the way, is parallel to the interpretation that we saw. I think he's going to mention a little bit later, about was it 2 weeks ago, in Chukat, about the sort of different takes about the transition, 3 weeks ago, I guess, about different takes about the transition turnover of the generations, and that this second generation had complaints about water and things like that sounded similar to the generation that left Egypt. Just the generation that left Egypt was saying, "Send us back to Egypt," and this new generation was saying, "Get us on into the land." Right? They were forward looking, not rearward looking, and so consistent with that reading, Rav Samet is suggesting that the purpose of this story, if it's not that Moshe caught their, potential, civil divide, and headed it off and got them to agree to stay unified for the battle, but rather it was that they were always intending to do that, and it's indicative of the changeover of this generation that Moshe kind of didn't understand and didn't didn't identify. This misunderstanding exemplifies the distance between Moshe and the people about to enter the land and provides further justification for the need for a change in leadership. Thus, we have directly opposing views of the purpose of the story, which disagree concerning both Moshe's behavior and that of the two tribes. Right? Did Moshe misunderstand or know exactly what was going on? Were the two tribes on board all along, or having to shift from wanting to be completely uninvolved to agreeing to participate in the conquest? This obligates the student of the narrative to decide. Is the story criticizing Moshe, or is it praising him for addressing the challenge? Is the story criticizing the tribes of Reuven and Gad for their request, or is it ultimately meant to testify in their favor? Let us analyze the story from the beginning with a view to choosing our standpoint. Okay, so we're going to start with setting the scene for the story. Now Rav Salman is going to take different, unusual, standout dimensions of the narrative and attempt to draw out from these unusual or different kinds of textual phenomena which direction, which interpretation it might point towards. The beginning of the story, included in the setting of the scene in verse 1, is strange in that it begins with the object of the sentence. Much cattle was possessed by the tribes of Reuven and Gad, a great multitude. Umikne rav haya livnei Reuven, etc. A typical biblical sentence begins with the verb. There was to the tribes of Gad and Reuven much cattle, a great multitude, right? Vayihiyu livnei Gad v'livnei Reuven mikne rav. Or sometimes a sentence starts with the subject. The tribes of Gad and Reuven possessed much cattle, a great multitude. Livnei Reuven v'livnei Gad haya mikne rav. What then is the reason for the unusual formulation of the opening sentence of our story? There are some stories in which the opening word is meant to fix the central message in the linguistic consciousness of the reader or listener. Right. So here we're not using one of his key ideas, which is the leitvort, the milah mancha, the frequently appearing word, but we're just noticing the first word, the kickoff, the kind of title word almost. For example, the story of those who desired meat back in Baalotcha, and the multitude, v'ha'asaf suf asher b'kirbo, that were in their midst. See the shir on Baalotcha, which we learned. The same can be said of our parashah. The cattle is a central issue in the story. It serves as the basis for the request by the tribes of Gad and Reuven, and determines for them their preferred inheritance in the land. It is also dealt with further in the negotiations between them and Moshe in the second half of the story. So it winds up being a recurring word, but it's significant that it's the opening word. The Torah uses a number of different terms to denote the herds and flocks of animals raised by man. They are sometimes called tzon, or tzon uvakar, sometimes be'ir, and at other times mikneh. This last term emphasizes the possessive aspect, the fact that they are the property of their owners, right? Mikneh essentially means owned property, could refer to something else in theory, but that the main owned property in that time was cattle. I'm assuming. So hence this general term referring specifically to that. This last term emphasizes the possessive aspect, the fact that they are the property of their owners. The word mikneh is used 6 times in our story, as mentioned by the tribes of Gad and Reuven, or in connection with them. Surprisingly, Moshe does not use this word even once. Even when he repeats their words, he's careful to use a different term. Build yourselves cities for your children and sheepfolds for your flocks, sonchem. It should further be noted that the scene setting in verse 1, which opens with the word mikneh, concludes with the same word. Behold, the place is a place for mikneh, cattle. Thus, both the two tribes are characterized by ownership of mikneh, and the land is characterized by suitability for mikneh. And this is, in fact, what links them, right? We'll just see it in the Hebrew for a moment, that opening pasuk. Umikneh rav haya livnei Reuven v'livnei Gad atzum me'od, vayiru et eretz Yazer v'et eretz Gilad, v'nei hamakom mikom mikneh. So we've got mikneh at the opening and mikneh at the end. The first mikneh is about it being the possession of these two tribes. The second mikneh is that the mikneh characterizes the quality of the land that they want to inhabit and inherit, is that it's a land, good for grazing and good for raising flocks. Okay. The first words, now the request of Reuven and Gad. So that was verse 1. The setting of the scene highlights for us this sort of through line of cattle. The first words uttered by the representatives of Gad and Reuven to Moshe are also introduced in a most peculiar way. Atarot and Divon and Yazer and Nimran, Cheshbon and Elaleh and Sevam and Nebo and Baon. The country which God smote before the congregation of Israel is a land for cattle, and your servants possess cattle. Right? We see it here. They came to Moshe and they said, and their words open up with a list of places. Atarot, Divon, etc., etc. The land which God conquered is cattle country again. Eretz Miknehi, Abadecha Mikneh. We have that same repeated theme. It's a land of Mikneh, and we have Mikneh. There's a match between this land and our property. They begin with a list of names of 9 cities which were honored in the kingdom of Sichon, and these 9 names occupy an entire verse. This is not a usual manner of speech. One does not normally list details without any introduction as to their meaning or context, right? The listener just hears a list of place names. They have no idea why are Reuven and Gad's representatives listing these places. Only in the second sentence do we find out why they're just rattling off place names. They should have said, the land which God smote, Atarot and Divon, etc., is a land for cattle. But even had they worded their request thus, we could nevertheless ask to the purpose of the list of names of these cities. After first presenting the geographic and economic conditions relevant to their petition, Reuven and Gad proceed to the actual request. They said, if we have found favor in your eyes, then this land shall be given to your servants as a holding. Do not bring us over the Jordan. Why does the verse insert once again the phrase, they said? Let's just go back and see that. So we have, they came to Moshe and they said, Atarot v'Divon, etc. This land is cattle country, and your servants have cattle. And they said, right? It's translated here as it would be a favor to us. They continued if this land were given to your servants as a holding. In the Hebrew, literally, it's and they said it would be a favor to us, but they were just talking the sentence before. So why do we need another and they said? No one seems to have interrupted their remarks. What does the new introductory phrase add? Additionally, we must carefully examine their final comments, al tavireinu atayardein, do not bring us over the Jordan. We already noted the dispute between Abarbanel and the Akedat Yitzchak, whether this refers only to their final settlement, right? Don't make us settle on the other side of the Jordan. We want to stay here on the east side, but of course we'll go over for the conquest, right? Or even to warfare. Don't make us cross even to fight. We're just staying put here and never crossing the Jordan, thus implying that Reuven and Gad had no intention of assisting their brethren in battle. Which of the two explanations better accommodates the straightforward meaning of the text? The key to understanding the request of the tribes of Reuven and Gad lies in these final words, do not bring us over the Jordan. The straightforward reading of the word ta'avirenu, bring us over, suggests that they refer here to their bodies, not their permanent residence. Thus, we prefer the approach, says Rav Samet, taken by the Akedat Yitzchak, that Reuven and Gad had intended to remain on the east bank of the Jordan, even during Bnei Yisrael's conquest of the land, right? They were saying, don't make us ever cross the Jordan River. Don't let our bodies have to cross the Jordan River. If so, then presumably the representatives of Reuven and Gad sensed the inherent problem in their request. They're receiving the land most suitable for them by abandoning their brethren who must wage war to capture theirs. They therefore decided to present their request in a subtle manner, rather than asking directly. They figured they would simply present the facts to Moshe, who would hopefully suggest on his own that these tribes remain in the land of Sichon. They carefully crafted their remarks accordingly. First, they enumerated the 9 cities in the newly captured territory that came unexpectedly under Bnei Israel's control. What will happen to all this fertile land after they cross the Jordan? Will they just leave it empty, inviting the occupation of the surrounding nations? Then comes the implied solution, and your servants possess cattle. From both a political and economic viewpoint, it is in the nation's best interest to settle the land with cattle ranchers. They assume, therefore, that Moshe's offer would be immediately forthcoming, right? So they see that this is where they want to be. They don't want to cross over and fight the war, but they know that's an unreasonable request. They just get to waltz right into their land, and all the other tribes have to go fight for theirs, and they're not going to participate in that. So they try to make a pitch to Moshe to help him get there on his own, that this is economically, politically advantageous to the entire nation to have them just stick around here and settle into this land and populate it. Of course, they could not expect Moshe to overlook the moral difficulty of their absence from the war across the Jordan. After all, why should they receive for themselves the territory conquered by the entire nation, staying behind, as the other tribes fight for their land? To mitigate this ethical dilemma, Reuven and Gad refer to the land of Sichon as the land that God has conquered for the community of Israel. Right? This is part of the greater Israel that God gave to us, and so let us just go ahead and take it as the conquest continues on the other side. The Akedat Yitzchak observes that they mention God nowhere else in their monologue except in this verse. He thus concludes, with this mention of God, they intended to say that they do not seek something for which Bnei Yisrael risked their lives, but only that which God conquered for them, not with their swords or bows. Since God, not Bnei Yisrael, captured the land of Sichon, the ethical issue of their annexing the territory for themselves is laid to rest. Reuven and Gad finish speaking and await Moshe's response. Okay, so now we're getting to that why the repeated Vayomru, right? So we get the narrative setting with the Mikneh emphasized at the beginning and end of verse 1. We are told that Reuven and Gad come to Moshe. They rattle off the list of cities to get Moshe thinking about, how are we going to ensure that these cities are securely held? It's a land of cattle, and we have cattle. So, and look, this is something which God conquered. So why don't we just stay here? Well, before they get to why don't we just stay here? That's just sort of the layout of the facts. And then, like you're supposed to do in fundraising, they lay out, even though they haven't made the pitch, they lay out the facts, the need, and then they wait. To their surprise and dismay, they hear nothing but silence. Moshe doesn't come back and say, just thought of something. You guys should stay here. This uncomfortable pause, which essentially foiled their plan, accounts for the new introduction in the following verse. They said, right? Now we understand why we have a repetition of the and they said when they go ahead and make their pitch explicitly, because they finished laying out the facts, hoping that Moshe would invite them to stay on the east side on his own. And when he just sits there quietly, they have to make the further pitch themselves. This uncomfortable pause, which essentially foiled their plan, accounts for the new introduction in the following verse. They said, Moshe understands what they want, but he wants to hear them say so explicitly. He thinks to himself, do they really plan to remain behind as their brethren go to war? They then present their request directly, and Moshe realizes that the time has come for harsh rebuke. So we already see that Rav Samit is all in on the Akedat Yitzchak's approach as opposed to the Abarbanel, that they truly did not intend to cross over, understood why that was complicated, tried to set it up for Moshe to invite them. He doesn't. And so then they go ahead and make their request themselves. And Moshe now gears up for his pushback. Okay, Moshe's response. Moshe formulates his response in a way that most effectively expresses his somewhat startling message. The innocent request of Reuven and Gad threatens to bring about a catastrophe similar to that which resulted from the mission of the spies 38 years earlier. He opens and concludes his response with 2 verses of rebuke, 2 at the beginning, 2 at the end, while in between he recalls the tragedy of the spies. Wherein lies the specific point of comparison between the tribes of Reuven and Gad and the generation of the spies? Significantly, Moshe never accuses Reuven and Gad of lack of trust in God, of unwarranted fear from the nations of Canaan, right? Those were key sins of the scouts. After all, Bnei Yisrael, including Reuven and Gad, had fought valiantly against Sichon and Og. Their request to remain behind during warfare involved no fear or lack of faith. Similarly, Moshe does not in this monologue point to any lack of trust on the part of the spies or their generation. He rather takes the tribes of Reuven and Gad to task for their inappropriate attitude towards the land that God had given them. He recounts that he sent the spies to survey the land, but they came back and turned the minds of the Israelites from invading the land that God had given them. Anyone who spurns the land that God has given them is considered disloyal to the Almighty. Therefore, only Yoshua and Kalev merited entry into the land, for they remain loyal to God. Similarly, Reuven and Gad saw the lands of Yazer and Gilad, just like the spies looked upon the land. Like the spies, they did not see the land that God had given them. They rather saw a land, meaning the east side of the Jordan, that suited their economic interests. Moshe thus feared that these 2 tribes, like the spies, could easily dissuade Bnei Yisrael, all of Bnei Yisrael, from continuing on to Eretz Yisrael. After all, They had before them a large, spacious territory. They had finally arrived at fertile grounds. Why not settle there and leave the task of conquering the land for a future generation? If they would influence the rest of the people, God would react just as God did upon the spies' return. He will abandon them in the wilderness, and you will have brought calamity upon all this people. In one sense, it now becomes clear why Moshe's attitude changes once Reuven and God agree to join the other tribes in battle across the Jordan. He no longer feared that they would persuade the other tribes to remain on the east bank, since now not a single tribe would settle its portion before the others complete their conquest, right? By the time the conquest is complete, and now Reuven and God in this new plan would go back to the east side of the Jordan, everybody is in the land and it's open in front of them to settle in. So it's, just stay put. Okay, these two tribes are going back east, but everybody else is not at risk of desiring as a result to rush back east. They have their territories in front of them. Secondly, the preparedness of these tribes to join the battle and even stand in the front lines attests to their proper attitude towards Eretz Israel. Through the language of action, these tribes demonstrated their full identification with the destiny of God's nation, the conquest of the land that God has given you, and the settlement therein, regardless of their decision to dwell on the opposite side of the Jordan. Nevertheless, it seems that there remains room for criticism of their preference of the land of Sichon over the land of Jewish destiny. How does their decision to join the other tribes in war resolve this problematic issue, right? They're still in some way spurning the land that God has given them, Eretz Canaan. What is it about agreeing to join in the battle that addresses that issue? Following the end of Moshe's speech in verse 15, there is a break of a Parashah stuma, a kind of a paragraph break. And then we are told, meaning as it appears in the actual scribal text in the Torah, then we are told, and they approached him and said, why did the representatives of Gad and Reuven have to approach Moshe again, even though they had not gone anywhere? As we saw, the Abarbanel and the Akedat Yitzchak are divided as to the interpretation of this verse. The Baal Akedah maintains that they approached Moshe following a break, illustrated by the closed parashah. This sort of paragraph break means like pause in the action. They go back and discuss, regroup, and then come back again, during which they held consult among themselves. And after formulating a new proposal, which would cancel the accusations which he had leveled at them, right? Then they approached Moshe following a break, during which they had consult and formulated a new proposal. According to the Abarbanel, on the other hand, their words were an immediate response to Moshe's speech and were meant to point out his misunderstanding of their original request. Therefore, they approached him in order to explain quietly out of respect for him. Let us examine the contents of their words. If the Abarbanel were correct, it would have been sufficient for them to point out the misunderstanding and to correct it. In other words, to clarify to Moshe that they intended to fight as equals with their brethren. But in fact, they commit themselves to more than this. They promise to pass over armed before Bnei Israel, and even to follow the process of their settlement in the land, right, until they are brought to their place. They're not even going to leave when the conquest is complete, but let them settle first. This commitment is surely new and requires some consultation and decision-making, right? They didn't just say, oh, you misunderstood us, of course we're coming along. It seems like they went one or two steps further after Moshe responds to them. And hence a regrouping might have been necessary. We therefore find ourselves returning to the Baal HaKedah, meaning the Abarbanel, who understands that they intended this all along and they just needed to gently clarify that to Moshe. Why would we need this break? Why would their response seem to be building and offering more than what Moshe wanted from them, which would have been what they were thinking all along? But the important question here is why the tribes of Reuven and Gad made this commitment. It seems that it was meant to serve as a counterweight to their request to remain in the land conquered from Sichon from then on, after they understood from Moshe's words the severity of their request, right? Once they really got what Moshe was saying to them about the risks and dangers of their request, they said, okay, we're going to go in, and not only that, we're going to go first, and not only that, we're going to stay longer because we need to counterbalance what, the dangers that you've raised for us. If this had been their original intention, to participate in the conquest together with their brethren, and Moshe had misunderstood it, as the Abarbanel maintains, then it was not they who were obligated to make some placatory gesture with a new and magnanimous commitment, but rather it would have been Moshe who should have somehow placated them. But not only does Moshe not placate them, following his seemingly baseless accusations, nor praise them for their commitment, rather he launches into negotiations with them, stipulating a dual condition, right? Fine if you do as you say, but if you don't do as you say, etc. As if to say, I do not know whether you have spoken wholeheartedly or whether it is simply deceit. It is therefore clear that Moshe understood their original intention, which arises quite clearly from their request, do not bring us over the Jordan, meaning at all, and he justly accused them in his response. His monologue achieves its intended effect and reveals to the representatives of Gad and Reuven the seriousness of their request. They in turn consult among themselves and formulate a new proposal, which addresses Moshe's accusations against them. Then they approach him and present their new proposal, which is indeed acceptable to him, with minor changes, which also teach us something of the materialistic perspective of these tribes and of Moshe's educational personality. And so we find ourselves interpreting the story along the lines of the Baal HaKedah. We discover that the story points its accusation against the tribes of Gad and Reuven, while depicting Moshe as a loyal shepherd who takes on the challenge posed by any danger to his nation, conducting complex and sensitive negotiations aimed at bringing about a favorable conclusion. Last paragraph. Even according to this interpretation, we must point out that ultimately our story also points to the great difference between the generation of those who left Egypt and the generation destined to inherit the land. It is specifically against the backdrop of Moshe's comparison of these two tribes with the spies that we find highlighted the fact that the tribes in question are quick to deny any such similarity. Without any psychological or practical difficulty, they place themselves at the head of the fighting forces for the conquest of the land, right? So we see already, the significant transformation or development of this second generation, that, even if they were considering staying on the east side of the Jordan, they heeded Moshe's words and were able to kind of pivot to this approach of, really wanting to go into the land and, play a role in the conquest, and even be leaders. They were already somehow, even though the materialism was pulling against them, quickly able to kind of snap to the readiness to do that, something which, seems like it would not have been imaginable for the generation that went out of Egypt. So here I think we get less of the structural analysis, that we've seen some weeks with Rav Samit, less of sort of counting how many psukim are in this section and, what is the central theme of this section. We got a little bit of literary, a couple of close readings that build up the point that he wants to make. We get, as typical, presenting to us one or two, sometimes three, this week really two approaches. And, whereas I guess many weeks he'll give two approaches, point out the difficulties with both of them, or three, and then present his own. Here, I think it's more that he's bringing new and different arguments over and above what were presented by the two sides in order to support the reading of the Akedat Yitzchak. So it's not that it's his own interpretation as much as it's his own, proofs that he's adducing to support the interpretation of the Akedat Yitzchak. Questions, comments, thoughts on this story? David L., please.
Thank you for taking us through that. I have a couple of observations and then a question for you.
Great.
Vayigash is an unusual word in the Chumash, and obviously brings us back, Vayigshu, right, and brings us back to Vayigash and Bereshit.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to note that in both cases, it's correcting the understanding of the listener. And in one case, it's an offer to remain behind. And in other case, it's reversing a desire to remain behind. And I don't know what to do with any of that, but that was just something that jumped out at me.
Nice.
With regard to Mikneh, I think it's interesting to talk about cattle land versus agricultural land, which certainly has deep roots in American history. And if you think about what are the Sheva Minim of Eretz Yisrael, it's agricultural produce. It's not cheese, yogurt, um, milk, although oat milk perhaps. Anyway, that's just another observation. And but my question, which you can certainly punt on, is there's been a lot being written recently in the academy about diasporism. And I wonder if a Rav was going to bring this text and this subject on this Shabbat, and certainly with divisions within the Jewish community about Israeli policy, how would a Rav frame this if such Rav wanted to talk about this week?
Yeah. Good. I'm gonna try to say something on each of the three if I can recall them. I think the Vayigash is a nice parallel. I'm also thinking about the fact that an alternative verb would have been Vayikrevu, right? We've been seeing Vatikrevun with Vayakre with Benot Salafchad, so sort of bringing a case as opposed to bringing yourself near. Is it sort of the what is it the people or is it the claim? So just more to add there to the considerations of what is the verb of engagement. Second point is to say I wish I had it at my fingertips. I think Rev Meidan and certainly others from that general school, the Rav Yoel Ben Nun kind of school, have written about the kind of agricultural versus shepherd aspects of Jewish history or the phases of it, and how that sort of plays out in the Torah. But I don't have that handy, but there's definitely something there. To the third, I mean, I'll say this. I had the privilege to give a yahrzeit shiur in New Rochelle a number of weeks ago for a friend's mom, and the topic was balancing the rhythms of our everyday life with connection to what's going on in Israel. And I said that I think the Moshe's comments to Ruvain and Gad are a refrain that we have to carry with us in some way, right? Whenever your brothers are going to war and you're staying here, you have to think about in what ways are we responsible, and then what happens if we see it differently than those who are participating. So that's definitely something I think about. The importance of shared destiny, and then of course, yes, going back to diaspora and Israel relations, the idea that I think the more you feel a sense of shared destiny, the more you feel motivated to give input on what's happening and how it's impacting all of us. And how does the other side feel about that? Obviously, these are all, brushing a lot of groups with one brushstroke, and it's, more nuanced in every place. But I think it is a very powerful text for laying out this relationship. But of course, I would also say, one of the challenges of there are always a million challenges with applying any biblical text to today. One is, I think, of course, it's a different moment. And I think the Torah means to in some way understand, always hold this out as a different moment, like the responsibility of participating in the initial conquest as opposed to any future time. I'm not sure about that, but I think the arrival in the promised land in this sort of first time, when we were at that moment in the eyes of the Torah, or Moshe wanted us to be, or the expectation was that we would be one, united nation, is one moment. I don't think it's automatic that then, as the communities spread out, that all goals have to be unified going forward. These are all very tentative thoughts, and I appreciate the question. And probably many Rabbanim might avoid going head on with these incredibly powerful texts, as profoundly relevant and ripe as they feel for this moment. Maybe they're too hot for this moment. Who knows? So thank you. Bracha, bevakasha.
Yeah, first of all, I'm on David's team. I also right away felt the resonance of Parshat Vayigash. And, I sort of wondered, why that language was used and what it's referring back to. And that was, I think that was Yehuda approaching Yosef as the king, as the second in command in Egypt. And it felt conciliatory, like trying to approaching with the idea to create connection, communication, that type of thing. And that made me think of how different the approach of these 2.5 tribes were to others who had a different perspective from the leadership, like the Korach rebellion and things like that. That this was, I don't know if they were settled themselves in how they understood the situation. It's hard to know. And I don't know what their actual intentions were, but the consciousness to want to be willing to discuss it, as opposed to complaining or demonstrating, which had been the operating method up until that point in most of the situations where there were conflict. There's something very powerful about that. And I guess something else I was wondering about, Reuven, Gad, and Chatzi Shevet Menashe, I was just kind of writing out the letters of the names of those tribes and separating the first half of Menashe from the other half. And then I added that up without the last 2 letters. And that was 356, which spells Shin Nun Vav, which is Shanu, which may have shown whatever their perspective was, their willingness to be able to make a change for the purpose of this, for the larger purpose of the people and peaceful solution kind of.
Beautiful.
So those were things that were crossing my mind, and then I'm wondering why no one ever talks about the other half tribe, and how difficult it must have been, and what integrity it must have taken for half a tribe to say, no, we're not going along with this.
Yeah. That's in and of itself. And we hear the focus was on Reuven and Gad, but then the Chatzi Shevet Menashe comes into the story, and how does that figure, I think, is absolutely an interesting topic, and great speedy math. And it's interesting because I heard the Shanu from you and was thinking about kind of the, they set themselves on a different path. But I think you're emphasizing their willingness, having done that, to then kind of reconsider the consequences and kind of engage again. divert from their diversion, so to speak, or from their divergence. So that's also really interesting. Thank you, Dad.
The Chatzi, Shevet, Menashe. I've seen two very different translations. One is half the tribe of Menashe, and the other is the half tribe of Menashe, meaning Menashe is not a full tribe. It's a half tribe because it's half of Yosef.
Ephraim is a Chatzi Shevet and Menashe is a Chatzi Shevet.
Yeah. So I don't know which one works best, but it is different.
That's very interesting. That's interesting.
I think when I looked at it today, when you gave the chapters and verse, so I went ahead to the end, and Robert Alter, I think, translates it as the half tribe of Menashe.
I'm thinking then, how many tribes are there? I guess if you count Levi and those two as halves, you get back up to 12. But you have to count Levi if they're each a half.
Yeah.
Joseph and Binyamin counting Levi. Yeah. You can make the math work. So great. Okay. Thanks everybody for a wonderful parasha, a wonderful chumash, a wonderful year. It's just such a great group to learn and digest with. Thank you for always being up for the ride as we explore different modern commentaries, and the generative discussion is always my favorite part. And hope everyone has as restful, as peaceful a Devarim as possible. And we look forward to starting up again in the fall when we return to Chumash Bereshit. And we've got lots of other learning opportunities and things going on, of course, between now and then. So look forward to seeing and connecting with everybody. Thanks to all. Love to Mom and Dad. Good night, everybody.